Hi, everyone. Welcome to the 50th episode of the Catholics Against Militarism podcast. I'm really happy that on this milestone episode of 50 episodes, we are going to talk about the 75th anniversary of the dropping of the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It was 75 years ago, on July 16th, 1945, when the United States government exploded the first atomic bombs over the deserts of New Mexico. A few weeks later, on August 6th, we dropped the bomb on Hiroshima, and on August 9th, we dropped the atomic bomb on Nagasaki. Today, we're going to talk about George Zabelka with Father McCarthy. George Zabelka was a Catholic chaplain, a Catholic priest, who asked to be sent to the war. He wanted to be where the action was. He wanted to be with the men who were fighting. And he ended up on Tinian Island in June, July, and August of 1945. He was the Catholic chaplain for the 509th Composite Group. He was at the center of it all. And Father McCarthy came to know him in the 70s and, in a kind of roundabout way, discovered his history. Father McCarthy did an interview with him and sent it out to about 50 Catholic magazines in the late 70s. And none of them were interested. George Zabelka said, "I want to expose the lie of Christian war, the lie I fell for and blessed. I want to expose the lie of killing as a Christian social method, the lie of disposable people, the lie of Christian liturgy in the service of homicidal gods, of nationalism and militarism, the lie of nuclear security." We can only assume that the Catholic publications who rejected that interview were not similarly interested in exposing any of that. You guys know I'm a teacher, so I'm going to assign you a little bit of homework today. This is an important time from August 6th to August 9th this year. Treat this as a little pilgrimage. I want to invite you into a little bit of extra meditation, a little bit of extra learning over the course of the next few days. Explore this topic a little bit, and I'm going to give you some ways to do that. Before you listen to this podcast, I would encourage you to read a couple of very short pieces. You could probably read them in 5 to 10 minutes. The first one is called Blessing the Bombs, and it was written by George Zabelka. It was one of the very few things he ever really wrote about his experience. It's called Blessing the Bombs. The other thing I would read is that interview that Father McCarthy did in the 70s with Father George Zabelka called A Military Chaplain Repents. If you read those two things, I think you'll get a lot more out of this podcast. If you have an extra 50 minutes, so if you have a total of 1 hour over the next several days that you can spend, read those two articles and then watch the documentary that was done about George Zabelka called The Reluctant Prophet. You'll get to see him, you'll get to hear his voice, and then this podcast might have a lot more meaning for you. 75 million people were killed in World War II, and 40 million of those, over half, were civilians. Now, we all know that according to the Catholic just war theory, it's not allowed to kill civilians. So why were there so many Christians participating in this? Well, we came up with a new word, I suppose, right? Collateral damage. I think of this in the same way that I think of pro-choice people calling a baby a fetus, right? If you can call it a fetus, it's not a human being, it doesn't count, and there's nothing wrong with it, right? Well, if you can call 40 million people collateral damage, I guess it's okay. So we need to think about this. We need to think about Christian participation. Another thing we talk about in the podcast is the ongoing, to this day, sort of censorship in the Catholic world, in the Catholic punditry, Catholic newspapers, Catholic magazines, about war and violence. We're still in the war that started after 9/11. Do you ever hear anything about it? Do you hear the bishop say anything? Do you hear your priest say anything? It is interesting to me that I didn't hear about the story of George Zabelka through any Catholic magazine or podcast. I heard about it on LouRockwell.com. LouRockwell.com published the Military Chaplain Repents article with Father McCarthy. That's a website that has to do with, economic and political Austrian theory of economics kind of stuff and libertarian political philosophy. It's not a Catholic website. Although Lou Rockwell himself is a public Catholic, That's not the focus of their website. A military chaplain repents. The article, the interview with George Zabelka, ultimately was translated into many different languages, and it went around the world, but only after it was published in Sojourners, which is a Protestant magazine. Another example we'll talk about in the podcast that I just feel is important to mention up front is that after the article went around the world, Father McCarthy ended up filming a conversation. It was called Conversation on Christian Nonviolence. It was a conversation between himself, Father Zabelka, and Mayreed Corrigan Maguire, who was a Nobel Peace Prize recipient from Ireland. Great conversation, and he sent it to EWTN, and he said, I think, the Catholic audience might be interested in this conversation on Catholic Christian nonviolence. And EWTN told him, no, we're not interested because we are a Catholic station and this is not Catholic material. So, it's perfectly fine to talk all day long about just war theory, which is supposed to provide a very rare exception to Jesus' teachings of nonviolence, but the minute you actually talk about nonviolence, people will tell you that's not Catholic. So EWTN would not even allow this to come into the minds of people, wouldn't allow people to be exposed to this. We have to ask ourselves about that, and we have to start questioning why that is in our church. It says in the Catechism, every act of war directed to the indiscriminate destruction of whole cities or vast areas with their inhabitants is a crime against God and man, which merits firm and unequivocal condemnation. A danger of modern warfare is that it provides the opportunity to those who possess modern scientific weapons, especially atomic, biological, or chemical weapons, to commit such crimes. So it merits firm and unequivocal condemnation. Do you hear that among mainstream Catholics? The firm and unequivocal condemnation of the dropping of those bombs? Or are you more likely to hear them defend it by saying, oh, we needed to end the war, it saved lives in the long run, blah, 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 blah. Now, this probably wasn't in the Catechism in 1945. In fact, in 1945, the Catholic Church was basically teaching people that if your country went to war, it was your duty to participate in that war, and it was a sin not to. Now, I don't know if that was on the official, that's not dogma, that wasn't official, but that was the message that was being sent loud and clear. It'll be interesting to see when we're talking about the desecration of churches so much, and churches being vandalized and set on fire and destroyed in the past few years. It was when Charles Sweeney was flying the B-29 bomber over Nagasaki. It was a cloudy day, and he didn't know where exactly to drop the bomb. And what he spotted poking out from the clouds was the steeple of Urakami Cathedral in Nagasaki. And Charles Sweeney was a Catholic. Here we have a Catholic fighter pilot flying a plane and dropping an atomic bomb on the oldest and largest Christian community in Japan. If you can't see something really, really wrong with that, then I urge you to please do some investigation in the next 3 days and think about this and pray about this and meditate on it. It'll be interesting to see in the next few days with this topic of the desecration of cathedrals and churches, if any Catholics will make that connection. You just have to look at that one picture of the famous picture of the man standing in front of Urakami Cathedral, completely destroyed by another Catholic. Another thing that we talk about in the podcast today with Father McCarthy is a lunch that he went to with Father George Zabelka and Charles Sweeney. If you listen to this podcast and you're hungry for more and you want to continue investigating this, I would recommend listening to episode 5 of Behold the Lamb. It's called The Church, a Fold of Lambs, and it talks about the significance of Nagasaki, which was the oldest Christian community in Japan. Another thing that you could read, more homework for you, this is after you listen to the podcast, you might want to read the little booklet that Father McCarthy put together called August 9th, which reflects on the significance of that day. August 9th was also the day that Franz Jägerstätter was beheaded. We've talked about him a lot on the podcast. And it was the day that Edith Stein, St. Teresa Benedicta of the Cross, died at Auschwitz. So just in terms of dates, this is a 75th anniversary of the atomic bombs, but August 9th is also a very special day. So I invite you over the course of the next few days, I'll link to all these things. Listen to this podcast, watch these documentaries, read these articles, And I think this time of year will begin to take on a new significance for you. And pray for us, pray for all of George Zabelka. May he rest in peace. I think you're going to learn a lot about him today. He was a true voice for peace, and a great example of repentance and what that looks like and what that means. And I hope you find this podcast inspiring. And thank you so much for listening. God bless. Let's get started.
Blessed is our God at all times, now and always and forever and ever. Amen. Heavenly King, Consoler, Spirit of Truth, present in all places and filling all things, but encompassed by none. The treasury of blessings and the giver of life. Come, dwell in us, cleanse us of all stain. Lead us along the way, today, tomorrow, and forever, as you want us to travel. We ask all this through Christ our Lord. Amen.
Amen. Thank you for that prayer, Charlie. And so thank you for being here, Father McCarthy. And I'm looking forward to hearing more about your friend, George Zabelka. I was wondering if you could start by telling us, how did you meet this person? I think the story of how you met him is pretty great.
Okay. So George Zabelka was the Catholic chaplain in June, July, and August of 1945 of the 509th Composite Group, which was the atomic bomb group on Tinian Island at the time of the Second World War. It's a convoluted story, but it's one that shows the grace of God actually operating in human history. Long before I met George, I was giving a summer course, teaching a summer course at the University of Notre Dame. That would have been 1969. And there was this Dominican sister there from Adrian Dominican, and she came to the course. The course was on nonviolence, and it was packed. I mean, literally, we had a room in O'Shaughnessy Hall, Liberal Arts Hall, and every seat was taken and people were standing. Well, she had a seat way back in the, as I looked at it, right-hand side of the room near the windows. So I got to make my introduction, who I was and what I was doing. I was not a priest at this time, and what the course was all about, and I gave them the list of readings for the summer. Well, when she heard one of the books on the list, sister just decided that she didn't want to be in the course because she had been in two courses the previous 2 summers, and both of them had the same reading, and she didn't want to go through it again because she didn't get that much out of it. And the reading was John L. Mackenzie's Power and Wisdom, his interpretation of the New Testament. John L. Mackenzie being at the time, the premier biblical scholar in the Catholic Church. Well, anyway, she wanted to get out, but she couldn't get out because the door to get out was on the other side of the class, and the class was packed. So she decided to stay. Sister decided to stay and listen to the hour and a half and see what happened and change classes after. Well, she liked how it was going so well, and it was all new stuff to her, that she just decided to stay for the whole class. And eventually we read The Power and the Wisdom, and it exploded for her. She just exploded. She hadn't seen all that was there in the first 2 courses. Anyway, that was the end of that. The next summer, I remember very specifically, I was walking on the path between the old field house and the library, and lo and behold, here comes Sister the other way a year later. And she tells me all of what she'd been doing for the whole year, et cetera, et cetera. And she said, I've been thinking about this for a while, she said. Would you like to come and give, it couldn't be a whole summer, but some kind of retreat, maybe for a week, to the leaders of our order in Adrian, Michigan, the counselors, I think they were called. And I said, well, how am I going to put a whole week into a summer, 6 weeks into 1 week and so forth? I said, I'd be willing to try. And so about 6 months later, she called again, and I went to Adrian, Michigan, and took this whole summer course, which was already truncated from a whole semester course, down into 1 week. And then the next step was that after we did that, the counselors decided they wanted all the sisters in the Adrian Dominicans to hear it, but they couldn't bring them all together. And they asked, would I go to the various places where they had convents, places to live, and do it. But they said it would only have to be for a weekend. That's the way my weekend retreats on gospel nonviolence began. I did that for the sisters, and one of the places I went was where this sister, Mary Ann Dixon was her name, where she was the religious education director, which was St. Basil's in East Detroit. And she had some other sisters there with her. And we did very, very well. We probably had about 5 different weekends there while she was the religious education director for adults, and the pastor was very helpful, Jerry Britz and so forth. Well, one of the sisters that was with her was not an Adrian Dominican. She was a she was a sister of charity from Cincinnati. And she took to it right away. She got it. She came to the talks many times over the years. And lo and behold, she gets elected provincial. So she becomes provincial. And she asked if I would give a one-day thing now on gospel nonviolence to all the sisters of her province. So I said, okay, sure, we'll do that. And we had it in Royal Oak, Michigan, and it just went terribly, just terribly. Halfway through, when we had the lunch break, I remember one of the, it was the ex-provincial came up and she said, "This is not going well at all. This is much too severe for our sisters." I was flabbergasted, but be that as it may, I never had gotten that kind of response. It was much too severe for us, for anyone. But after it was all over, I was kind of glad it was over, because after that lunch break, I kind of felt down about doing it, and I did it. And well, anyway, what took place was a sister came up, a sister of charity of St. Joseph, sister charity of Cincinnati. And she came up and she said, "Are you giving this anyplace else in Michigan?" And I said, well, in about 3 weeks, I'm giving a Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, one conference, and a Sunday, Monday, and Tuesday, another conference, same conference, up in Oxford, Michigan. And she said, okay. She said, where is that place? And I told her. And anyway, when I got there, she was there, and she had brought the religion department from a high school.
Okay.
A Catholic high school in Lansing, Michigan, and they were all there to make the weekend retreat. One of whom was the chaplain of the school, a man by the name of Bob Lunsford, very nice man. And so they made the retreat. And that was that. That was that. Then, it would be about 1973 now, I believe. Bob Lunsford suggested to the Bishop Zaleski was the bishop at the time of the Lansing Diocese. He suggested that there was a need to hear this. There was a real need for the priests to hear this, because he knew they did not understand it at all. They were just not aware. It's not something that had come in, they could come in contact with normally. And he said to the bishop, he said, "This is one of the few times in my life that I have heard a proclamation of the gospel." And so that was that. And the bishop decided to do it. And he set up a retreat for all the priests of the Diocese of Lansing, all the priests. And he really did a wonderful job. He made sure that it was free in a nice retreat house in Brighton, Michigan. And he told them that he'd make the arrangements for order priests to take over their parishes during the week. This is a Monday through Thursday retreat, huh? And so forth and so on. He sent out 2 letters inviting them. He couldn't have done more, really, to make it a workable thing. And so that was that. And I was really, I don't know, hyped for it. You know, to educate the educators, you know, that really gives you some real potential, you know, because then they educate, and if they know something, they can speak on it. If they don't know it, they can't speak on it. Well, anyway, in the meantime, what takes place is that this sister, this nun, Sister Agnes Patrice was her name, the Sister of Charity, who invited all the people to come to the retreat in Oxford, and who heard me at the day that went so badly for the Sisters of Charity. She was taking a course on liberation theology down at the cathedral, just a course that they had for adults, you know. And who was giving it but this priest, George Zabelka. Okay. And she went up to George and she said, I don't know how this liberation theology works, but I know what you should do. You should hear this Charlie McCarthy talk on nonviolence. You should hear that. And then she told him, because she knew that there was going to be a retreat that I was giving on nonviolence, so all the priests of diocese, he should go. Well, here's how it happened. I got to the retreat house half a day before, and I was really pumped, as they say, you know. I was going to take it to another level. I think at that time there were 200 plus priests in the Diocese of Lansing.
Wow.
Of which 8 showed up. 8 showed up out of 200 and something. After all the bishops sent out free, everything else, 8 showed up for a retreat, a reflection conference on gospel nonviolence. So you see, that changes the way you have to even approach a retreat. Because if you think you're going to have 200 people, and now you're down to 8, you have to kind of move from a lecture pattern to a symposium pattern, that kind of thing. And so we did. We set up the tables in round sorts of ways, and people were there. So the content is the same, you know, but you even present it in small groups differently. You don't even talk the same as when you, all that sort of business. So that was it. But anyway, so that's what I did. And by golly, right there, Ellen, I tell you, of the 8 priests, there was this one guy that sat on the end of the table. He had his big dog next to him. And I don't know, you know, usually when you're in this sort of thing, people kind of raise their hand to say, you know, I got a question or a thought. He didn't raise his hand. Yeah, wait a minute now, wait a minute. He just interrupted. And, you know, as the retreat went on, you know, he pounded his fist on the table about, what about the Japs? What about the Japs, you know? What about the Nazis, you know, that sort of thing. And so, I mean, it made the situation extremely uncomfortable because I'm not a priest. They're all priests. Every morning we had mass, and there were the 8 of them on the altar, and I'm the only person in the pews, you know.
I was going to bring that up. I think it's important for people to know you didn't get ordained until 1981, and this was in
81, yeah. August 81.
And
this is 73.
Okay, so yeah, you're trying to teach the priests who have been through 7 years of seminary school or whatever.
And most of these are your old-time priests, you know?
Yeah.
They're not recent graduates, you know?
Yeah.
Anyway, this one guy, he just made life impossible. No, he didn't, I don't think he meant it, but he just, It's just his way, huh?
Mhm.
He had a question he wanted answered now, you know? And
Yeah.
besides, it was a small group. And anyway, when it was over, I was glad to get out of there. Glad to get out of there. It wasn't what I thought it was going to be, and it was worse than it could be, and so forth. Anyway, I'd say about 5 or 6 months later, I get a call from a Sister Helen. And Sister Helen tells me she's the religious ed director of St. James Parish in Mason, Michigan. And I come out and give a weekend to the adults on gospel nonviolence. So I said, sure, glad to do it, always, you know, and so forth and so on. And I said, how'd you find out about me? And she said, well, our pastor took your retreat way back with the priest, about, you know, whenever that was, she said, and he came back, and he's been reading about it ever since. And he just came to me one day and said, get this guy in here for a retreat. So I said, who's the pastor? And the pastor was George Zabelka. He was the priest sitting at the table, pounding his fist, interrupting, with his big dog beside him. He was one of the 8 that came to the retreat. And he came because of Sister Agnes Patrice telling him to go. And she came because of the sister who became a provincial, who was with Sister Mary Ann Dixon, and on and on.
Yeah. Wow.
There's a chain here. There's a chain here that no one could put together, but it's real, and it happened that way.
Wow.
I would call it a chain of grace, because everyone's doing a job, but no one's thinking that this is the job they're doing.
Yeah.
At any rate, what takes place is, I said, are you sure he wants me to come? You know, I mean, the presentation is on gospel nonviolence. And she, oh yeah, that's what he wants. That's what he said. Okay, I'll go. But I never expected, of all the people, he was not the one I expected to hear something from.
He was the most, belligerent.
He was the most belligerent and vociferous and aggressive, and just a tough guy, you know?
Do you think that he wanted you to come back to just debate you more? Because he was.
Well, I didn't know. And I thought of that. I thought going out there, this could be a terrible time if he's just calling me in to have verbal fights with me, you know?
Yeah.
So anyway, I got there, and my goodness, he had a full house. His recreation hall down under the church was packed. I'd say he might have had close to 200 people in the parish. He really set it up nice. He did everything perfectly. I mean, it couldn't have been, it's one of the better retreats where people set it up properly. I mean, as far as where to get a cup of coffee and the meals and everything, he really did a good job. And just to parenthetically say, he was universally known as a great, great pastor, a good pastor. I mean, a really, really first-rate Catholic pastor, all right? So he did it right.
Yeah.
And I remember, Ellen, he sat in the back, the very back of the 180, 200 people, all the time during the retreat. He sat in the back, said not a word, no argument, no anything else. And so we come to the end of the retreat. I'm thanking the cooks and the people that did the cleaning and all that stuff there, and thanking him and Sister Helen and all that business there. And he raised his hand. And he says, I got a question. But it wasn't like, I got a question. It was confrontational, you know? I got a question. And I said, okay, what? And he said, well, this is what I want to ask you. Do you mean, this is the question he asked. No one has ever asked it before. No one ever asked it since. But this is the question George asked. He said, do you mean to tell me that Jesus wouldn't enjoy a good boxing match? That's the question he asked.
I guess at this point in his mind, he's going through all the different manifestations of violence and trying to find one that maybe would be like, or something.
I was stunned. I never heard the question before. so I talked a little bit about history, the fact that in the earlier 20th century, boxing was outlawed in the United States because it was so brutal. And then it was illegal and on and on. And a little bit because at that time that I knew about how it affects the brain and what we call punch drunk now, which is pugilistic dementia and all that. And on and on. And I said, I just, and besides, I said, I did a little boxing myself. I said, and I know that you could go in there with all the spirit of love and kindness you want. You get hit in the nose once and everything flies out the window. The whole system turns to something else. So I said, no, I don't think Jesus would want people to be involved with hurting people just for his entertainment. He never said anything else. That was it. And so that was it. And I left. And I go, well, it was a good group. We just let the ripples go out and see what happens. About, oh gosh, I'd say, Ellen, 7 months later, Sister Helen calls again. She wants another retreat. I said, are you sure? Because I said, you had practically the whole parish there. We had 200 people there. She said, who's left? And she said, don't you worry. She said, if Father George tells them to come, they'll come. And this doesn't mean just my parish. This means where at the other places he's been. He'll get them there. And sure enough, he did. And I went out. I gave the whole thing again. And he sat in the back for the whole time again. And then at the end of it, the same thing happened. I'm thanking people, ending it all, and he raised his hand. And he says, I have a question. And I said, okay. And then he gives me this question. And he had to be preparing this question for months. It was long. It was convoluted. And if, and what, and why, the whole thing. Concluding with, now, wouldn't Jesus use violence under those circumstances? It was, the people were listening to the question. It's so long and convoluted, they couldn't follow it. And he said, now, wouldn't Jesus use violence under those circumstances? And I just looked at him and I said, nope. And the whole group laughed and everything. They knew what was going on. They knew what was going on. He smiled too. He knew what was going on.
Yeah.
Anyway, that was it. That was it. And I had no other contact with them. So that would have been 74, I think, about 74, early 75. Anyway, in Christmas of 1976, it was, I got a Christmas letter from him. I never got that before. And it was a, what would you call it? One of those kind of like purple mimeograph 4-page things, on both sides. And
yeah.
He was telling about this and that and the other thing. He had about a half a page on his dog, Henry, and what Henry was doing. And these sorts of things here. So I nice, he sent it to me, but I wasn't interested. And then in the second last paragraph, he says approximately this, and it's almost word for word now. He says, I don't want to offend any of you. I certainly don't want to lose any of you as friends. But he said, I got to be truthful with you. I've listened to this retreat by this fellow, Charlie McCarthy, on gospel nonviolence for several times. I've read the books. I've read the books he said to read. And he said, I just have to be honest with you, and I'm not trying to offend anyone or judge anyone. But for me, Jesus taught a way of nonviolence, and he was nonviolent. And that means that that's what I have to teach and be. I was stunned. He started at paragraph out, I've got to do an about face. That's the military, turning all the way around. Right?
Yeah.
I've got to do an about face, he said. And then he started, I've gone to this retreat several times. That was it. That was it. And I know after the fact now that about a year later, he retired. and from being an active parish priest, which he was proper to do, was right to do, because he had had a massive heart attack in '69, and this was perfectly legitimate. And I also know that he was going around, not just Michigan, but all kinds of, with the videotapes that I made in 1977 at Michigan State called Truth and Choices, 15 videotapes well done on gospel nonviolence, half hour each. And he was giving retreats, and he even gave a whole weekend retreat to one person up in the Upper Peninsula. He went to Duluth, he went to Minneapolis rather, I know. But I was out of contact with them except to hear things here and there.
Yeah.
So then, I think this is the way it went. Once again, it's before I'm a priest. I was giving a retreat at the Newman Center at Michigan State. The Newman Center at Michigan State. I was giving a retreat there. And on the Saturday morning of the retreat, who walks in the back door but George? And he sits, and I thought to myself when I saw, oh boy, here it comes, you know?
And this
anyway,
is 1978, you said?
This would have been 79.
Okay.
Yeah, about 79, about the fall of 79, I think even. But anyway, he comes in and he sits there, and then he comes up afterwards, says, hi, blah, blah, blah. And he says, what are you doing for lunch? Would you like to go out for lunch? And I said, well, yeah, that'd be great. He said, I'll pay for it. I said, well, I told these students over here I go out with them. He said, bring them along, I'll pay for the whole thing, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, that was it. So we went to this place, long table, you know, and I remember I got clam chowder. I remember that. And it was terrible because it wasn't New England clam chowder. It was that New York stuff. At any rate, I remember, and we're sitting at the table, and this student at the upper end of the table says, look what I've just read. I just finished this book. And he says it's about the bombing of Hiroshima. And he said it's about the bombing of Hiroshima. And do you know what these guys did after the bombing? And they went back to the island, and he started talking about drinking and blah, blah, blah. Kind of like a MASH situation, you know. And anyway, I was listening, and George said something to the effect of, well, you know, he said, you can't believe everything you read. You know, I mean, these guys writing this stuff, they're far removed from the reality. And the kid said, well, he said, look, this book, it says right here, the New York Times says there will not be a better book written on the Hiroshima bombing for the next 50 years, you know, and this person gave it a 5-star review. And so, I know, said George, you know, but it's still, you got to be there. You got to know the situation. This is kind of just an encapsulation of it. So there's always more to it than that. So the kid got kind of fresh, and he said, you know, because fresh in terms of that day and age with a priest with a collar on and so forth. Mm. And he said, how do you know so much? And George said, because I was the Catholic chaplain of the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bomb groups. That's the first time I knew it, Ellen. Right at that second. I couldn't believe it.
Wow.
I thought I didn't hear it correctly, because no one else heard it. He said it, but no one heard, and the conversation just passed on to other things. And so I went back to the Newman Center. And before us talking after he left, and I asked the priest there, Tom, I said, Tom, did George Zabelka, was he part of the Hiroshima and Nagasaki stuff? And Tom, who'd been a priest for 15 years or whatever, he said, you know, I heard something about that, but never talks about it as far as I know. He said, I can't say for sure. Maybe he was. So I don't know, a few weeks passed, and finally I called George, and I asked him, and he said, yeah. And I said, would you be, George, would you be opposed to, I don't know, having someone write a book about this in you or something? He said, no. He said, but I've put stuff out there long ago. He said, no one's interested. He said, he said, no. He said, yeah, fine, I'll do it if you can get someone. So I went about and I knew a couple of people who were world-class Catholic writers, celebrity known worldwide, priest. Mm. And the big thing was they came out of the same kind of training George did, which was the priesthood in the 40s and the 50s and that sort of business. They knew that world, see? And so I presented to them the situation, and I told them, I said, would you want to do a book, or, you know, on this? This is quite a conversion, you know, extreme from Nagasaki and Hiroshima to nonviolence. And they said, no, they weren't interested. They didn't have time. It wasn't, you know, it was fine, but it wasn't for them. And I searched around, I could find no one to do anything. Mm-hmm. And so I decided, well, the way we'll do it here is maybe to get things started, I'll do an interview with George and try to get it published. So George and I did a telephone interview over a period of about 3 weeks. I would give him the questions over the telephone. He'd write them down and think about them. Then I'd call back and he'd give me the answers and I'd write them down. Okay. And that's the process we went through, right? And so I remember it was February 2nd or 9th, 1980. George and I met because I was on my way out to Ames, Iowa to do a retreat for the Catholic worker out there. And I drove and I stopped at in Lansing, and a friend of mine, Joan Tirac, was the chaplain at the Lansing Cathedral, college campusry. There's several colleges, and that's where they had and we met at Joan's chaplaincy place, you know, next to the cathedral, and we talked, and you know there were little changes he made, like I think I said that I think I had written that 60,000 people were killed at Nagasaki, and he wanted that at 40,000, and he immediately killed it. All these, nothing big, and he was happy with it and so forth. And
Charlie, can I stop you real quick? I just wanted you to explain. I mean, it might seem obvious, but why did you think it was so important to get this interview, to get this story, when everyone else was like, oh, he was involved in that, but they didn't care? Why did you know it was significant, that he was significant, that his experience was important?
Well, I'd have to say it's the grace of God. But the dynamics in my mind, kind of, which were not articulated the way I'm articulating them now, they were just there as thoughts, was that this is not a conversion to an anti-nuclear stance. This is a conversion of gospel nonviolence. Mm-hmm. This guy, he's seen the whole picture, right? You want to know someone that knows about war? Before he was the 509th chaplain, he was chaplain in other places. He knows war. He's been there. Mm-hmm. He had paratroopers' wings. But the thing was that it just seemed to me, unlike so much else that was going on, this was a man that was talking about my experiences, not just how bad war is. My fundamental experience was what I never saw before, the truth of Jesus. And the truth of Jesus was not just nuclear war. It was all war, all violence, enmity. And it seemed to me it was important, but it didn't seem that way to most people. Because when we were at Joan Tirac's, I remember, I was going to tell you this little story to give you a sense of George's personality. When we were at Joan Tirac's chaplaincy office at the cathedral, as we were leaving, Joan said goodbye. I said goodbye. I hugged Joan. Joan hugged me. Joan hugged George. And George says, he said, now wait a minute, he said. This gives you a personality insight. He said, now wait a minute, he said. I like the peace movement. I agree with what a lot of people are doing here. I want to hang around with them. That's what he said. And Joan knows this to this day. We laugh about it. But then he said, but what's the need for all this hugging? We don't need hugging. Different world.
Yeah.
Different world, different person, and so forth. It turned out, though, I'll tell you this, that in a couple of years, George was one of the great huggers on the face of the earth, you know, as he interacted with the people of the peace movement and so forth.
All right, I just wanted to take a little, like, to just explain the significance of that. But yeah, so you, back to after the interview that you guys did on the phone, you met in person, and that's where I cut you off. So if you want to go back to that.
Yeah, and that interview, that little thing about the hugging, that's where we went over the whole interview piece by piece, word for word, settled that.
Yeah.
And then I left to give my retreat in Ames, Iowa, and then I came back. And then I sent that interview out to 30, maybe more than 30 publications, Catholic. Journals, books, newspapers, diocesan newspapers, even sent it to the Catholic Worker. No one wanted it. No one wanted it.
That's so shocking to me.
I have no idea. I have no idea why. No one wanted it.
Do you think if it was just a conversion to be a part of the anti-nuclear movement, which was really gaining steam in the church in the late 70s and early 80s, a lot of bishops were on board with disarmament and all that stuff. If it had been just that, do you think it would have been more popular? Was it the fact that he was renouncing all violence, all war? Was it just taking things too far for people?
I don't understand it because this is a guy that knew war, totally committed to the military. Huh? Mm-hmm. He once was reprimanded by the United States Army for too much zeal. He was a soldier, you know, and here he is, and he makes this total conversion. It's the equivalent of Saul on the road to Damascus becoming Paul, the violent Saul becoming nonviolent Paul, and no one, it just didn't hit. It just didn't ring at all to anyone, and no one wanted it. So that was that. And I just gave up. I mean, I got the responses. Some responded, most didn't. You know, mm-hmm. And that was it. I just left it sitting there. And then I got a call. I think in May from a new group down in Washington D.C. Sojourners, and the person there said that they had seen the interview, they had gotten it from someone, and they wanted to use it as their cover story for their August 1980 edition. They had just started the magazine. And so I said, fine. No, they wanted to talk to George and so forth and so on. And so I gave them his private phone number, that sort of business there, they did. And they wanted some pictures. Lo and behold, George sent them all kinds of pictures, I guess, from Tinian Island. But the one they put on the cover, they said was him, and it wasn't. Just one of those things, you know. But anyway, the article came out in their front page, August 1980 edition. And I think the title they put on it was, "They Told Me It Was Necessary," something like that. And it just went viral, as we say today. It went viral all over the world, all over the world. And the last time I heard anything about this, which was in the late 80s, it had been translated into about 25 different languages, you know, including Chinese. And from that point on, George was a nonviolent celebrity. People were calling to give speeches here, talks there, this, that, and the other thing. And of course, he graciously did it, and he could talk, and he was, and then on he went from that. And and a movie, a film company from England called me about 1985, early 85, and said they wanted to do a documentary on George. They'd seen the article, and they thought this was a great possibility for a documentary, and they just didn't know if there were enough clips there or whatever it was. So I said, sure. So I gave him his number, and they came here. And I don't know how you finance these things and so forth, but they came here, 5 people flying across the ocean, flying to Michigan, flying to every place they had to fly to do this, huh? And they made a first-rate documentary on George's life called The Reluctant Prophet. And it came out in the summer of 1988. And it's just a wonderful it covers the reality of it, it covers the reality of it. And it portrays him very, very accurately, huh? And played all over England and Ireland, Australia. It's in English, huh? Australia and so forth and so on. This one guy, Peter Kearney, he's in England and Australia and so forth. He's a major folk singer. He saw the documentary and he wrote a song, My Name is George Zabelka, that has gone viral all over the world, and so forth and so on. So the company sold it here for maybe 6 years, 5 years, very reasonable, $24 or something like that on a VHS. And it really didn't get much of a, they got some, but not much. And so Pat and Bart finally said, well, you take it and whatever you can do with it, do with it. So since then I've been putting it out there and all kinds of things. But let me just make a point here, which is not quite on George. And that is that documentary, Reluctant Prophet, has been shown on television all over the world. I know a priest that saw it in Rome. Now, anyone who listens to it there's no subtitles, it just has to be in English. Huh? They have to be able to speak English, but it's all over the world. All over television. It's television quality, it's a television quality product, Hollywood quality product. Big money put into it, huh? No secular or Christian television network would take it to play in the United States. No one.
Wow.
No one. This is fact, this is documentary, this is true life stuff. This is in the only country that's ever used atomic weapons. And this is the Catholic chaplain of that bomb crew, and he's made this conversion. EWTN, none of the Catholic networks, none of the Christian networks, and of course, none of the secular networks, cable or otherwise. An occasional person over the decades has gotten it on their local cable station. I think one of them was in Denver someplace, but very rarely has, at any rate, if any of you folks want to see it, it's now available on the internet. It's available on my website. It's you can download it. It's all there. Or you can get a right to you, and you can send them a copy of it, or the DVD. But the point is that no one wanted it in the United States, and yet this is about a United States Catholic soldier, lieutenant colonel, 22 years in the military, who makes this conversion. And this is supposedly a Christian country. So after just go back to the chronology now. After the August 1980 article in Sojourners, a priest by the name of Jack Morris, a Jesuit, calls George and says, he says, George used to wear this button all the time after his conversion, big white button. It said, do something for peace. That's all it said, do something for peace. George was a doer, And of course, do is the most used verb by Jesus in the gospel. But he said, pray, do anything, hand out leaflets, do, don't just sit there and talk, you know?
Mhm.
So anyway, he was an active kind of guy, you know? And he never really lost his aggressiveness because he, no violence, you know? But anyway, Jack called him and said, hey, I got something, you know, what we can do. He said, let's start at the Bangor nuclear submarine base in Washington, walk across the country, and then walk across Europe, making arrangements to talk at every church, Catholic or Protestant or whatever, or synagogue if they want, that along the way in cities or towns or whatever it is, nothing's too small, nothing's too big. That would be a 7,500-mile walk over 2 years, from Bangor, Washington to Bethlehem, Israel. And at 67 years old, George agreed to it and started it. It was called the Bethlehem Peace Pilgrimage. There are still people, Jack's dead, George has died, of course, but there are still people alive today who walked on it. And George walked at 67 years old, the 7,500 miles with the group, talking to here, there, stop everything, you know?
Yeah.
And so that's one of the things that came out of it.
Wow.
Another thing that came out of it, Ellen, which people don't know. There was a bishop by the name of Frank Murphy. He was an auxiliary bishop in New York. And this appears in Jim Castile's book on the American Bishops' War Peace Pastoral. See? And what took place was this. Bishop Murphy, the auxiliary Bishop Murphy, is the sole person, a sole singular person who started with the idea and introduced it to the Catholic bishops at their national conference for writing their 1983 War Peace Pastoral, A Challenge of Peace. Bishop Murphy started that whole process. Now, he had to have a lot of help after he started it, but he was the one that brought the idea to the bishops, to their committee and so forth and so on, and pushed it.
And it was, okay, so for people who don't know, so the Challenge for Peace, can you explain that again?
The Challenge for Peace was the 1983 American Catholic bishops pastoral on war and peace that made such a big splash.
It did.
They spent millions preparing it. With scholars and everything else, you know?
Okay.
Now, what I did not know, and I think George died not knowing it. In Jim Castile's book on the history of that pastoral, Jim Castile talks about the fact that when he interviewed Bishop Murphy and asked him how this all got started and everything, and he recorded this, and this is his answer. He's got the recording, he got the word for word recording. He said, I've always been concerned about the problem of war, and there's something wrong with us participating in it, and Catholics he's talking about, you know, and we don't say much, and I don't know. He said, it just was something that was always inside me to think about and forcing myself to think about it, requiring myself to think about it. And then he said, I read this article in Sojourners, and there was this priest, Father George Zabelka, who was the Catholic chaplain of the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bomb crew. And he said, I read that article. And he said, I was just so struck by it. I said, I got to do something about this. And what I came up with was to make this proposal to the National Conference of Bishops that they write this.
Okay, so the bishops meet like once a year, and people
twice a year.
And they can put forward like a suggestion of something to.
They can put forward suggestions, or they can vote on activities that they're going to fund and choose and do that sort of, as a group, as the National Conference of Catholic Bishops. So that's what he put before them, and they voted to do it. And then over a 2.5-year period or so, whatever it was, they did it. They really put a lot of time and energy and effort into it. And they came up with what is a challenge of peace.
Wow.
It's not much, but it's something they never did before.
Mm-hmm.
It's
Yeah.
an attempt. It's a brand new in the history of the church, you know?
And so his
So
motivation for that goes back
was
to
God.
reading that article.
Was reading that. He says it explicitly. He
Yeah.
says it explicitly. That's what started him. When he read that article, and he just said, I have to do something.
Wow. And I know.
These are how the ripples go out, Ellen, huh? We can't plan them. The thing about George was two things that's very important. He was a faithful Catholic and Catholic priest. He did it. Catholic. We're talking Catholic now. He did it. But he was faithful to what he saw was the truth.
Mm-hmm.
George also had courage. He was over on Tinian Island, and he was over with the, I think it was the 309th group that was bombing Tokyo and other things, huh? And all the pain and misery of that. He was over there because he pestered the United States Army Air Force to go into combat. Where he wanted to go where people were hurting, where people were suffering, where people needed priests. He could have stayed home and just been in a parish, but he wanted it. It took courage for him to stand up and say to his whole group of people that he's known for 40 years, I've got to do it about face. I've got to do it about face, and tell them he's made this conversion. There's a courage there, huh?
And when you say he petitioned to go into battle, you don't mean he was fighting. You mean he wanted to be
as a
in
chaplain.
the war as a chaplain.
As a chaplain.
But he did learn how to become a parachuter, though.
Yes, right? In 1941, he was ordained June 7th, and he served in parishes in Lansing. And in 43, he asked to become a military chaplain. And then he went to military chaplaincy school at Harvard. Cardinal Cushing, which Archbishop Cushing, then blessed his military chalice, which I have here, and not his regular chalice, but he blessed his military chalice. And then he was sent off to, I believe it was Wright Air Force Base, to be a chaplain. But that's not what he wanted. He wanted to go where the action was, as he said.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why.
That's
why he wound up there.
Okay, and he was, so Tinian Island is also Northfield Air Base?
That's right. Tinian Island was the largest air base in the world in 1945. 4 planes could take off a minute from 4 separate big planes, B-29s. That's where they did the bombing of the firebombing of Tokyo. This was it. This was the place, you know, and therefore. This was really active military operations of all kinds, yeah.
And so as a Catholic chaplain there, he was the chaplain for the bomb crew who dropped the bomb on Nagasaki or Hiroshima, or both? Both.
The 509th Composite Group was based on Tinian Island, but it was secluded. It was chained off from every other group on Tinian Island, I'm sure because of secrecy.
Mm-hmm.
And George was on Tinian Island as the chaplain of the 309th Army Air Force Group, which was the group that was bombing Tokyo.
Okay.
In June of 1945, he got his orders that he was to be the chaplain for the 509th Composite Group for June, July, and August of 1945. Okay. And therefore, he went there.
So he would have known all of the people in the bombing crew that were Catholic.
At least the Catholic ones, huh?
Yeah.
At least the Catholic ones, and that was his. And I've seen by the way, once again, going back to, he was a Catholic pastor, first rate, you know.
Yeah.
I've seen the records of what he did there, because he had to send in records to the chaplaincy guy in Washington, you know, every week or month, however it went. And they had elaborate columns to fill out to prove you were doing your chaplaincy job. How many rosaries were said with people? How many masses did you? How many confessions? How many anointings did you do? You know, how much counseling did you do? Et cetera, et cetera. Every one of them. I mean, the guy worked hard. The guy worked hard as a chaplain. And no names are ever mentioned, of course, in those reports, only how many numbers.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, he worked hard. He worked hard.
And
By the way, yeah, that's June, July, August 1945. He was the United States Army Air Corps chaplain for the 509th Composite Group.
And when you're interviewed in The Reluctant Prophet, the documentary, and you tell the story that when he first started hearing what you were saying at the retreat, you know, George was like, I've been a Catholic priest all my life. If this is true, why have I never heard it? You know, didn't he ask you that at some point? Like, if this is the truth, why have I never heard this before? And
yes, he did. Yes, he did. And it's hard to get the question right. Right? But the way it sounded was, as I heard it was, I'm a Catholic. I'm a Catholic priest. I went through seminary. I studied all these things. If this is the truth, why have I never heard it? And the question was appointed, you're wrong. You can't be right. That was the purpose of the question, you know?
Yeah.
And
what was your answer to that? Like, how did you respond?
my answer to that was, at that point there, I remember when at that point I said, I don't know why I know what the answer is now, but then I don't know why you never heard it. It's there to hear, you know?
And what would your answer be now? Like, what would your answer be?
The answer now is that Jesus teachings in the Gospels of nonviolent love of friends and enemies has been universally censored in all the mainline churches for the Catholic Church for maybe 1,500 years, and for the Protestant churches for maybe 400 or 500. I mean, the leaders of the church, bishops, superintendents, whoever they are, depending upon the community, they just don't let people hear this. They don't let them hear it in elementary catechesis and adolescent catechesis and adult catechesis, and they don't let those they're training for the ministry hear it. He never heard it. That doesn't mean it wasn't there.
Mm-hmm.
The way George said it at another point, he said, it's the Jesus teachings of nonviolence. It was never said, but with everything that was being taught, it was kind of submerged, which means he was sensing things, but as I was, you know, I mean, but yeah, it was kind of submerged. You just you couldn't even ask the question. There was no situation in which you could imagine that you couldn't go to war if the country called you to go to war. It just didn't enter the mind. So what was taught was to the best of people, the best by, I mean, the priest and the so forth and so on, and not taught well was Catholic just war theory. Cardinal John Wright, who went all the way to a doctorate in Rome and became one of the leading cardinals in the Catholic Church in Rome in the 20th century, Cardinal John Wright said publicly that in his whole Catholic education, all the way up to a doctorate in Rome, he had one 45-minute course on the morality of war, period.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what George was dealing with. That's the world that he lived in. And but his question was, it was aimed at me, because how can you be right if all these people over all these years are saying, you know, and the answer is, of course, they've bracketed out part of the gospel. They bracketed out of the pulpit, out of the catechisms, they just bracket it out, you know? They'll make an occasional reference to it, but that's it. It's to be kept out of mind. And why? Because the Christian refusal to kill people is the most dangerous thing on the face of the earth to governments. All governments run by kill power. And the kill power is only ordered by the boys at the top, or the girls. The people that execute it are the everyday Christians and whatever, Jews, Protestants, atheists underneath, what we call in the chessboard the pawns. And therefore, if you ever convince those pawns that this is not God's will to kill people, it's a real threat to the powers of the world, as it should be, as Jesus meant it to be. So kill power is what governments run on, and kill power is what Jesus rejects. And so, in order to stay in bed with the governments and get money and largesse and everything else, the leaders of the church, starting in the 4th century, found a way to say that Jesus' teachings included that you can kill your enemy, not that love your enemy means kill your enemy.
And those little tiny theoretical exceptions that we make, the censorship that goes on, the way we bracket things out, it all leads to that mushroom cloud that's behind you on the wall. Like, that was what it all led to, right?
That's what I saw. That's what I saw with George, huh? Remember you asked a question earlier about why did I see it and no one else saw that George, this was an important conversion?
Yeah.
It's because the entire history of humanity from Cain on forward leads to that mushroom cloud.
Mm-hmm.
Everything that is the spirit of evil and violence and enmity in human life culminates in the best of the best and the brightest of the brightest, and the most powerful, just putting it all together to build an instrument to kill 50,000 people in 9 seconds.
And it couldn't have happened if George, or someone like George, a Catholic priest, had not been there to basically bless it and say, this is okay, right? I mean, he provided the spiritual assurance for those people that it was okay to go do this.
Well, I'd say this. I'd say this, that yes, George was a symbol of the spiritual assurance that this was the will of God as revealed by Jesus. This was not mortal sin. This was not evil. But he was one of millions upon millions upon millions upon millions upon millions of priests and bishops that were a symbol of the same thing, starting after the time of Constantine. The assurance that the church is on your side if you're killing for the local politicians is what it comes down to. And that's been going on in the church since just after the time of Constantine. Mm-hmm. So that I remember Gordon Zahn talking about George, because George and I and Gordon Zahn, we got along together and so forth, and over the years, and met occasionally. And I remember Gordon talking about George and saying, there's no way in the world to condemn George for anything, because Gordon had done a long-term academic sociological study, which he published, on the Air Force officers in the RAF, the British Air Force, that were going over, and because it was the British that did the Dresden stuff, and the Cologne, and the wiping out of Hamburg and so forth, the massive bombings, fire bombings. And he said, yes, none of them objected. He said it was out of their possibility range of even thinking to object. Mm-hmm. There was no possibility. This is not what they were there for. They just didn't have anything in their minds. He said, if someone like George, a military chaplain, ever got up during the Second World War and objected to some kind of military tactic or plan, he said it would be unheard of. It couldn't, because no one could think of doing that. Mm-hmm. Okay? Besides the fact, just parenthetically, I've talked to a lot of people, priests, who have gone through chaplaincy school, and they all said the same thing. Right in the first few days, they're told, quite frankly, publicly, openly, if you believe in nonviolence, if you follow the nonviolent Jesus, if you're a pacifist, get out, because we don't want you here. Mm-hmm. That's kind of the way the chaplaincy works universally,
Mm-hmm.
and not just America, but Russia. My gosh, any place. So no, George was there. He gave the assurance by his presence of priest, presence by saying mass, the rosaries, and everything else. Huh? The whole paraphernalia of the Catholic Church, which is good, was now being used to validate atrocious evil. But no one saw it. No one saw it at all. George didn't, no one else.
Yeah, Charlie, can you explain the icon that's behind you? I'll put up a bigger picture in the video for people, but where did that come from and what is it?
That's Our Lady of Mount Carmel at Trinity site. The first atomic detonation in the history of the world was at Trinity site in the Mexico desert on July 16, 1945. At this point, humanity entered into a new, never before seen level of evil and destruction, and justified it. July 16th was also the day in 1283 when the Blessed Mother appeared with the scapular to St. Simon Stock, a Carmelite in Aylesford, England, and gave him the scapular as protection and so forth and so on. So over the years, it had seemed to me that there was some sort of connection between the two, as God puts things together in ways and time spans we don't understand. Huh? And in 1989, I was doing the 40-day fast for gospel nonviolence in Israel, all 40 days. And on July 16th, I went up to the Feast of Our Lady of Mount Carmel. I went up to Mount Carmel in Israel, where the Carmelites have a big monastery and so forth to celebrate Mass that day. And I thought, yeah, it's all very nice, good memory and so forth. And I did that. And after Mass and communion, I went outside and walked around the grounds, which overlooked the Mediterranean Sea. And it just occurred to me, I should not be here. I should be where the first atomic bomb was exploded on this day. This is prayer. Prayer is only meaningless if no one is listening. But if someone is listening, then prayer is very, very meaningful. Prayer is also love. Love is using up your time to do something good for another, right for another. And when I take even 10 seconds of my time to do something for someone, that's an act of love. So I thought about this and said, I wonder what's happening at Trinity. So I wonder who's out there. Is anyone out there? Is anyone there? Because this 89, it would have been how many years later, 40 years later, whatever. So that's what I decided to do in July 16th, 1989, and then gradually worked it out. And on July 16th, 1990, myself and 7 other people, we set up a little tent at Trinity site and spent 24 hours there just praying the rosary. Said Mass. One of those people that came that day, the first time, 1991, was George Zabelka. He celebrated the first icon celebrate. He was the primary celebrant in the first Mass there. And he would die within the year. Huh? So he was dead by this time the next year. And if you look at the icon closely, what you see is that it's Our Lady of Mount Carmel, the scapular over the arm, and the baby Jesus as the icon. And you can look at the face, and you can look at Mary and Jesus looking at each other, and Mary looking beyond Jesus at the mushroom cloud. And what she sees in the mushroom cloud is Jesus crucified. Whatever you do to the least, you do to me, teaches Jesus. One of the things when we talk about violence and Jesus' rejection of violence is that violence is about inflicting pain on people. And Jesus is not, no place in the gospel does he inflict pain on people. That is not the way of Jesus. That is the way of violence. And the church has been teaching, at least since the time of Constantine, oh no, he said that, but he really didn't mean it. You can inflict pain on people. Huh? But here's the point. Here's the point. You drop an atomic bomb, and whatever you do to the least, you do to me. You do to me. And that being the case, when you maim 60,000 people at Hiroshima, 40,000 at Nagasaki in 5 seconds, 9 seconds, whatever it was, and then the agony over hundreds of thousands of people being harmed and maimed and radiated and so forth, unless Jesus is kidding us, unless he's fooling us, unless he's just talking nonsense, whatever you do the least you do to me, then violence, including nuclear violence, is a direct attack on God. But maybe it's all a myth. Maybe it's just Jesus telling his apostles something to get them to be compassionate. Except consider this. When St. Paul has his famous moment, mentioned 3 times in the Acts of the Apostles, the whole story, when Paul has his moment on the road to Damascus, and he's knocked off his horse by a great white light, and he hears the words out of the light saying, "Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me?" And Paul says, "Who are you, Lord?" And he says, "I am Jesus of Nazareth, whom you are persecuting." He doesn't say, "I'm one of Jesus' disciples." He doesn't say, "I am Jesus of Nazareth and you're persecuting my disciples." He's saying that there is such a close relationship and love between God become human in Jesus and God's people, that when you attack, harm one person God loves, you harm him. That's just the normal in the human situation. When you harm someone that I love, I suffer automatically, instantly, because of that love. And so that's what Jesus says. And that's what that Jesus crucified in the atomic cloud is communicating. You are doing something to God that is terrible. He's enduring it. He's not stopping you. He's loving you. He hasn't stopped loving you. He'll forgive. All that's still so. But whatever you do to the least, you do to me. And when you see those pictures of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, there's hardly a military person in them. They're just ordinary human beings. Ordinary human beings going about their daily lives. Just going through the streets of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So that's what Jesus in the atomic cloud, that's what this icon of Our Lady of Mount Carmel at Trinity site, which people can get if they want a copy, they can get from you. Just write you however you communicate with people and gladly send them one. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. You can contact me at contact at Catholics Against Militarism. But yeah, I've been reading the book Hiroshima. If you guys have never read it, it's a very short book. It's a classic.
John Hershey.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's
incredible.
Yeah. So you're bringing me to tears when you're talking because
I mean, Hershey himself now, there's a man that somehow got outside the box of what he was nurtured in, and all the propaganda and everything else, and somehow he got beyond that into what's happening to human beings and what's really going on. That book is an incredible book, John Hershey. It's the first one that really raised the issue in a new way.
Yeah, and I think how many people died in World War II?
52 million.
50 million people, and I think it was, I don't know how many were killed with the atomic bombs, what, 200,000 or something? Or
about that, between the actual bomb and the radiation sickness and all, yeah.
Yeah, so we make a big deal about these two bombs, but they weren't, in terms of number of dead, it was a small fraction of the overall, with the Tokyo fire bombings and everything else. It was
Tokyo fire bombings killed more people than either Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
But I think
the fire bombings killed 100,000. Yep.
And at the end of the day, you don't care if you're killed by a nuclear weapon or just a regular bomb. It's the same suffering that it's causing. But I think the reason why it's such a big deal is that there was absolutely no way by this point we could justify. I guess I just grew up thinking of World War II as this necessary war. It was the good war. It was fighting Hitler, but it was just bombing civilians. There was no pretense anymore of soldiers out on the battlefield, government soldiers fighting government soldiers. It was just this havoc that was unleashed, and the fact that Catholics were still telling themselves it was justified when it was so obvious when you read this book that, women, children, old people, everybody was fair game. Everybody was fair game. So it's just gone so far beyond the just war theory at that point that you cannot possibly justify it in those terms. But people still did justify it, and to this day still do. They said it was necessary to end the war, etc. There seems to always be a justification, no matter how vile and just no matter how terrible it gets, no matter how obvious it gets. It seems like the human mind can always come up with a rationalization. Once you bracket that out and say, well, it's war, so it's okay.
There's no problem whatsoever, none whatsoever, in justifying the destruction of human beings in philosophy, in most theologies. It can easily be done rationally. It can easily be done rationally. There's no problem with it at all. Especially if you fear. If you fear death, if you fear pain, if you fear is the great mover of things. And the fact of the matter is, you simply kill those who are going to kill you. It makes all kinds of sense. Where it can't make any sense, where it's beyond the pale of anything but asininity, is to say it can be justified in the teachings of Jesus, or out of the teachings of Jesus, or is in conformity with the teachings of Jesus. It cannot be. Rationality, remember, Ellen, rationality, the rational use of the human mind, every human mind, whether it's the guy in the local pub or whether it's the philosopher in the university, all rational thought begins with what's called self-evident first premises. They're premises that cannot be proved by the person, but he or she accepts them because they are self-evident. They are evident to the person as true. Why do, let's go back a little bit. Why at the end of the 19th century down in West Virginia, there was that feud that went on for 14 years or so between the Hatfields and McCoys. During that time, Hatfields were taught that the McCoys were the incarnation of evil. They were not to be given any human consideration. They were to be killed. They were taught stories of how the McCoys killed them, and vice versa, the McCoys did it. It was self-evident after the first generation of that to every Hatfield that McCoys were evil and had to be destroyed, because that's how their minds were nurtured. What is self-evident? What is self-evident depends a great deal on what we're nurtured in as truth. I was nurtured in from the cradle that it was truth, that you could kill people in war, in self-defense, and be following Jesus and be loving your enemies.
Mm-hmm.
And that never, never, never left my mind until I was in my 20s. As a matter of fact, when I went to Notre Dame as an undergraduate, my book in moral theology explicitly said, it's called Christian Virtues, explicitly said, Catholics cannot be pacifist. It's against scripture and tradition. That's the nurturing I had. And that's all I could think.
Mm-hmm.
To think outside that box, the people that normally can do it are only the prophets and the poets sometimes. Most people, they are just stuck in the 2x4 world they're nurtured in. And that 2x4 world gives them their self-evident premises from which they logically deduce the conclusion, I could kill 50 million people. Or, as Madeleine Albright said on the 60-Minute show, when the United States had the embargo against Iraq and was keeping out food, medicine, everything that was needed, which embargo the international community said had killed 400,000 children under 12 in Iraq. And when Leslie Stahl asked the question, 400,000, that's as much as Hiroshima or Nagasaki. And she said, we think it was worth it. We, meaning her and Clinton and those people there, we, because we were working out of a nurtured consciousness that was erotic nationalism and erotic militarism, erotic empirism, and that justified the conclusion we can do it, and the value system, the moral conclusion. It was worth it.
Mm-hmm.
No, so that what you know, what you can justify rationally, depends where you start. But if you start with the teachings of Jesus in the Gospels, where everyone who's a Christian has to go, because these are universally understood, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, to have a special preeminence in all of the revelation of Jesus. Those are the words of the Second Vatican Council. They have a special preeminence, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and that they contain all that is needed for salvation, and what they say is true. If you start there, if that's where you get your premises from, you are never, never, never going to get to killing people, hating enemies, destroying enemies, war, or military chaplaincies, or anything like that.
Yeah. Going back to George, you mentioned courage, that he was just a person with a lot of courage. He wanted to go be a chaplain in the war. He became he learned how to do the parachuting or whatever because he wanted to learn how to do the things that his men were doing. So he was right there with them. But you told me a story once about Lanzo Del Vasto and how he didn't believe that children should be taught nonviolence. Can you explain that? Because I think that's related to what you're saying.
Yes. Lanzo Del Vasto was a European intellectual, doctorate and so forth and so on. I've got a picture here someplace of him sitting around at a table in Paris with Simone Weil. You know, that's the world he lived in. And the way he told it to me was that after, I don't know, it was about 36, 37, something like that, he came to the conclusion that with all his education, with all his learning, he didn't know why a fly existed yet. Meaning it dropped out of life. Huh? He's a Catholic man, but a thinking Catholic. And of course, this is where we're talking now in the 40s and 50s, the old Catholic Church, that there was almost no way to get outside the box. Well, anyway, he decided to go to India and spend some time with Gandhi. And so he went. And he spent about a year with Gandhi, and he really became a disciple, an understander of what Gandhi was saying, deep understanding of what he was saying, deep understanding of what he was saying, and what this meant in terms of Jesus and Christianity. So he wanted to stay in India with Gandhi, but Gandhi told him no, because you are European. You don't know the nuances of Indian culture, but you do know the nuances. And if you're going to be creative in a culture and creatively bring nonviolence and ahimsa, which is his word for agape, if you're going to bring, you got to know the nuances of people's looks and their actions and the words and so forth. So Gandhi gave Lanzo del Vasta the name which he kept for the rest of his life, Shantidas, which means servant of peace. And Shantidas went back to France and he founded something called the Community of the Ark, a nonviolent ecumenical community in France, exists to this day. And anyway, I used to invite people over here to, people from around the world, to give weekend retreats to people interested in nonviolence in America for 9 years. And one year I invited Shantidas to come, and he came. And I remember at the retreat, he told people, he said, don't bother teaching children about nonviolence. It's a waste of time. And people became rather upset, you nurture them, and he said, no, he said, they can't understand nonviolence. Oh, no. He said, now I don't agree with him on that, but that's what he said. But then he said, the one thing you've got to teach young people and adolescents is courage. Because if you don't teach them to have courage, then regardless of what you teach them about nonviolence, they're not going to do it. They're not going to do it beyond the point that it's going to take courage to do it. They'll walk away. You've got to teach them courage. So while I disagree completely with that you nurturing children in terms of rejecting violence and enmity and hate and all that, I do see what he's saying in terms of courage. Because there are, by the thousands, people who have taken my retreats, my conferences, everything else, and have gone out with real enthusiasm. And once they get back into their families, into the church, into the priest, into the ministers, and saw that it was going to cost, they gradually drifted away, and so forth. Be that as it may. Courage is the one thing that George Zabelka had. George had courage. Mm-hmm. And just the idea of wanting to go where the people were hurting and dying and so forth, and not wanting to stay home as a chaplain. The idea of jumping out of an airplane because that's what his men were doing and he wanted to be with them and take the same risks they did, et cetera, et cetera. Even the idea, Ellen, in 1976 of writing that Christmas letter to his friends for 55 years and telling them, I've got to do an about face. Jesus' teachings are teaching them. I mean, I know people today that won't even say that in their family.
Yeah.
Just let it go.
Do you know how people responded to that? Were they upset with him with that letter?
Oh, no. Everyone, I met a lot of people in Flint and where he was a priest, and other places over the years. And I'd say that I never met anyone. I mean, I met people who thought he was foolish. Mm-hmm. Say, oh, that's not going to work and so forth, but that's what he said, he'll do it if he thinks it, but not anyone that would turn against him or anything like that because of it.
Okay.
And by the way, just another example of the courage, that when the Poor People's March on Washington came, George went down there and he put up a tent right in the park and he slept with them for all the time that they were there.
Yeah, that's another great thing about
Started out on a 7,500-mile walking thing at 67 years old.
yeah, it's amazing.
Right.
That's another thing that's great about the documentary too, is the way it talks about his work with the poor and his work in the civil rights movement. And he just sounds like an amazing person.
There is one thing, Ellen, just to go with that documentary thing.
Yeah.
There is another video out there, professionally done, studio done, network done studio, called Conversation on Christian Nonviolence. Now that video is an hour video, and it was done in the studios of whatever the television network is up in Belfast. And it was a conversation with Mairead Maguire, who was the Nobel Peace Prize winner from Ireland, Catholic, with George, Catholic priest, Hiroshima, et cetera, and myself. And it was a 3-part conversation for an hour on gospel nonviolence and life, you know? And it's very revealing of George, very revealing, because unlike what would you say, The Reluctant Prophet, which is a documentary, huh? This is extemporaneous speaking, and it really is him, you know. And but anyway, here you got 3 Catholics, Nobel Prize winner, Catholic chaplain of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and 2 Catholic priests. And I sent that into EWTN.
Oh, they must have loved that. That's gold right there.
Their response was, "We only televise Catholic material. We only televise Catholic material." This is the censorship.
Mm-hmm.
This is the keeping out of ordinary Catholics' minds the truth of the gospel, that Jesus is nonviolent and teaches a way of nonviolent love of friends and enemies. We will not let that into the mind. We won't even give it a chance.
Mm-hmm.
And so this is just an example of it, you know.
Yeah.
Anyway, I just mentioned that because if people want to see that, that's on the internet too. And they can get it from you, or they can get it from all kinds of places.
Yeah.
I give it away as a DVD from Bob Arorian, et cetera.
Awesome. I'll link to that too. Can you briefly explain the picture of you and George and Gordon Zahn? Gordon Zahn is, for those of you who've been listening, he's the one who discovered Franz Jägerstätter, the story of Franz Jägerstätter, wrote the book about him called In Solitary Witness, which is the way Thomas Merton heard about it. Then Thomas Merton wrote about Jägerstätter in his book, I think, Faith and Violence. However many 50 years passed, and then the movie came out earlier called A Hidden Life, which we've done a couple episodes about. So Gordon Zahn is kind of a big deal. But there's a picture of you and George and Gordon. Can you just explain that picture, when that was taken, and what you guys were doing?
The picture of George and Gordon and I was taken August 9th, at the close of the 40-day fast, in Waterville, Maine, at the little repast or meal afterwards. And that's what we were there for. And we had mass, and so all the other things that we did, they closed it with an olive and all that. And we were just there chatting. And that censer that you see in the hand, that thurible is a more exact word. That came from the Nagasaki Cathedral. When George went over to Hiroshima and Nagasaki after the war, in September of 1945, there were no restrictions in terms of where he could go and so forth. And he wanted to see Nagasaki. He went to the cathedral, and he was just walking through the rubble. I mean, you've seen the pictures of the cathedral. It doesn't exist. It's a wall, a piece of a wall. And he was just walking through the rubble, and he saw this top of a censer, and he just picked it up and took it. And so years and years later, because I was ordained on August 9th of 1981, he gave me that as a gift, you know? Mm. And so that was the censer we had there. We were just kind of looking at it and talking about it. But yeah, I mean, Gordon's contribution to gospel nonviolence and to Christianity is every bit as much as George's, huh? And Gordon, in many ways, is his own hidden life. He was a World War II conscience objector. And he was the one that discovered the World War II conscience objector in Austria, Franz Jägerstätter.
Mm-hmm.
He wrote the original book on him after no one wanted to support or no one even wanted to talk about it. He got it done. And Gordon was the real deal. Gordon was the real deal. His ministry was scholarship, but scholarship, and he's a professional sociologist, PhD from Catholic University, all that. Taught at a professor at UMass, but the bulk of what he did was scholarship in terms of nonviolence, and that sort of business, and Christian nonviolence. I'm trying to think here. Like I said to you earlier, he had a book out there on the RAF, the British Air Force, and why they didn't say anything, why they couldn't say even the teaching of Jesus. Mm-hmm. He had another book out there, which was, it caused big problems, called German Catholics and Hitler's War. When it was published, it just raised havoc in the Catholic Church. The church went about trying to get it off the market, telling the powers in the church, telling his publisher that if they didn't take it off the market, no more Catholic books would be published through them, et cetera, et cetera. And yet his scholarship, and this is the hidden life, his scholarship is impeccable. To this day, he got it right, he footnoted it right, he did everything right. And therefore, this is a real contribution, because remember, part of what the dark powers of the world try to do is they try to steal history from you, or they try to rewrite it in their own way. They want to steal human memory and make human memory serve their purposes. Mm-hmm. And this is what Gordon did. He laid it out there, what was going on. He could speak, he could speak German fluently and brought up with it. He laid out what was going on in detail with Catholic cardinals, bishops, priests, etc. in Germany. And German Catholics and Hitler's War came out before Franz Jägerstätter's book. And the book on Franz Jägerstätter and Solitary Witness came out after. And indeed, Merton wrote an article, that's in his Faith and Violence. And I think he first wrote it for Catholic Peace Fellowship. But what's interesting, Ellen, is what Gordon told me is the first one he asked to write a foreword to in Solitary Witness was Merton. But Merton said he didn't have the time.
Really?
Yeah, kind of interesting.
That is interesting.
But Gordon was a wonderful man who has a hidden life, a great contribution to Christianity.
Yeah,
because
and
he was talking about gospel nonviolence and pacifism and doing it in terms of conscience objection, etc. No one was doing it. Almost no one.
Yeah. I think this is a good lesson for people just in terms of George's life. He said that he tried to send out some things about his experience in Nagasaki or not in Nagasaki, in World War II as a chaplain for the bombing crew, and no one was interested. And then, for several years, it looks like between early 1970s, 72, 73 through 75, 76, he was out there giving little retreats with your CDs, or not CDs, they would have been tapes, 8-tracks, whatever they were. But he was out there doing that. But it wasn't until several years later in 1980 when that interview was published in Sojourners. So you kind of have a theory about why it took so long for his story to come out, for people to hear about it, for him to be able to offer his testimony to the world. What's your theory there? Why did it take so long? Why do we have to wait decades for these things to happen sometimes,
Well, as Thomas Aquinas says, grace works through nature. Grace works through nature. It doesn't in nature, it doesn't stop nature, it works through nature. And George, like myself, was certainly nurtured in straight out just war stuff. This is what you do. You go in the military, you go in the army, you go in the Marines. It was okay. Now, George says, and he's got this in several places. George says publicly, I even believe it's in the Reluctant Prophet, he says, the first time that he ever began to get an inkling, I think he calls it a gut churning about war and Christianity.
Oh no, he says, I think I know the exact phrase, because I think he says a worm in his stomach or something.
That's right, a worm squirming in his stomach or something about this whole thing, is when he saw, after the war in September and October of 1945, and when he went to Nagasaki with another priest, and they wanted to see, because Nagasaki, remember, was the biggest Catholic community in Japan, and they wanted to go to the hospital there where people were staying and so forth, and I don't know, give them last rites or pray with them or do something, huh? And he saw the children, scorched and burned, screeching, agony of burns, pain, torn apart, but not dead. Skin burned off, just red. And he said, this was the first time. He said, these little babies had nothing to do with the war. What's going on here? What's going on here? And I think that, yeah, that's when it started. And like all of us, I often tell my comrades, and if you can, oh, gee, that's the wrong word to use.
You're a communist, don't you?
Yeah, I often tell my friends who are deeply involved with nonviolence and so forth, and really want to do something, you can't expect people to come in 4 days or a week where it's taken you 30 years to come. It's not possible. Occasionally, there's a person that, for whatever reason, their history, their mind, and so forth, bang, they get it right away. But it takes time for most people to break through the long nurturing that they've been in child and adolescence and from their peers and from the television. It's not that easy to break through and see the fallacy of it in terms of reality, in terms of the gospel. So what happened with George was, after he wrote that about-face letter of 1976, about less than a year later, oh, maybe it was a year later, he took retirement from his parish and base in Michigan, St. James Parish, which he had a right to do because he had a massive heart attack in '69 and was there because of the heart attack. He took him out of Flint and put him, and so that was fine to do. And so he retired, and then he got a set of what I'm calling now videotapes that I did in the studios of Michigan State, 15 half-hour tapes on gospel nonviolence. Now, they weren't tapes, Ellen, and they weren't VHSs. It was reel-to-reel he had to buy. So he got a set of these 15 reel-to-reel things, and he went around, started giving retreats, conferences on gospel nonviolence with these tapes, we'll call them. And I was told later that he actually went in the Upper Peninsula and went to the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, gave a retreat conference for a whole weekend, and there was only one person that came. But I know he went to Minneapolis. He just did this, eh? And no one was paying any attention to him, really. He was just, oh, well, fine, that's good, and so forth and so on. However, when in 1981, the article came out that Sojourners printed and went viral, as we say, and people began to ask George to come and talk on nonviolence, on the military, George is prepared to do it. Because during those 5 years, when he was going around with my audio tapes, videotapes, he was personalizing himself. he was hearing it, but he was putting it in his own mindset, his own consciousness, his own verbiage. And so when he went out there in front of public and everything else, he was more than prepared to answer the questions that had to be answered, talk about the things that had to be talked about. I will say this, as long as he stayed on subject. He had a way of getting mad and getting off subject with people, audiences. I'll give you an example. One time at Our Lady of Perpetual Help Church in Worcester, George went there and at my behest and so on, and he had a nice audience, nice talk, everything else, right? And he was advertised as the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bomb crew chaplain, all that. And during that, after that talk was over, this guy raised his hand. And he starts out by telling George he's a World War II veteran. Telling George he was on Tinian Island. He fought for Tinian Island. I think he said he was a Marine, maybe not. But he fought so they could have the air bases there. You know, he saw his buddies killed there so they could have the air bases there. And he said, what are you telling us now about we're supposed to love the Japs? They've killed they killed my friends. They, you know, on and on. And he went on. And George, first he said, yeah, I know what you're saying. But as the guy pushed it, George said to him, don't tell me about what you did on Tinian Island. I know what you guys did. You pushed those Jap women and children to the edge of a cliff, and then you gave them a choice of being shot or jumping off. Thousands. I know you did that. It got bad. This was not the purpose of it being there. So after the thing was over, I said two things to him. I said, George, first of all, you gotta stop using the word Japs. You know, you just gotta stop. This is not. I know it's in your vocabulary, and you don't mean any. You know.
Yeah.
But I said, the other thing is, you're not here to discuss military strategy. You're not here to discuss how things, you know, you're here to tell people what Jesus' teachings are.
Mm-hmm.
All you had to say to the guy is, yeah, you understand his position, but is that what Jesus would do? And you as a Christian are called to follow Jesus, not to follow this, that, or the other person.
Yeah.
And he did. He really straightened that out 99% of the time. But every once in a while, you get excited and get off subject. And
well, there's a picture of him kind of talking to you where he's like got his arms up and he looks like he's really telling you something important. And I like that picture too.
that one took place on August 9th in Toronto. We were closing the fast there, August 9, 1985 in Toronto. And George came up to close the fast, and he had a big crowd on some big, I don't know, a city hall or someplace, really big, and so forth. It was really a nice way to close the fast, and then we can celebrate liturgy at the Ukrainian Byzantine Church in Brantford, right outside of Toronto, and so forth and so on. But there were all kinds of little events that we were both involved in on that day. And I remember that picture. What George was there, he was telling me how things should be done. That's what you could see it in the picture. He's just laying it out there, how things should be done. Yeah, and this was personality. You
described him as like a real alpha male. Like he was.
Oh my goodness, he was alpha in the extreme. Yeah. Oh my heavens, yes. This is how things should be done. And I knew him enough by that time to know, he's talking, and you don't argue back at this point, you know. You just don't argue back. So I was just there listening to him. Yeah, and he was telling me how things should be done in terms of something that was going on, you know.
Yeah.
No, George. I remember his friends in Michigan, his friends now, would joke with him about the fact that even though he believed in gospel nonviolence, he really hadn't changed much. And they'd point out little things that he did,
Yeah.
yelled at someone over, he didn't, and so forth. And they used to tell him, as you're not practicing what you preach. Not practicing what you preach.
You got to do more hugging, more hugging.
You're not practicing what you preach, they tell him, because something would go wrong in the church and he'd get excited, whatever. Someone wouldn't do something right or whatever the case may be. You're not practicing what you preach. And his answer was always, a good answer, it was, they didn't ordain me to preach what I practiced. They ordained me to preach what Jesus practiced. Good answer. Good answer. Yeah, no, good answer.
Now,
but a lot of things are going around this time too that we don't want to forget, because everything happens in terms of a milieu. Text is always in terms of context, as they say. And the Martin Luther King phenomenon was going on. And by phenomenon, I mean nonviolence, because King probably did more than anyone in the United States to even just get the word out there. The Quakers were nonviolent for 300 years, but Quakers, But King got the word out there and used it all the time. And like he said, there's now King is kind of reduced to a civil rights guy. But King himself said, there are few things in life that you live out till the end that you'll give your life for. And for me, that's nonviolence. So he was a real Christian man. But George was watching it and so forth and so on. And when George was at Sacred Heart in Flint was a tough city. Tough city because of the unemployment. Tough city because Black people from the South were coming up, and there were no jobs, and there were no and things and George set up a lot of programs to try to get help for people that needed help, all of whom, for the most part, in his part of the world at that moment in time, were Black. Most of them were Black. Mm-hmm. And at least everyone I ever talked to from Flint, Black or white or Asian or Hispanic or whatever the case may be, everyone always said he was the most real civil rights man there was. He was out there. Whatever needed to be done, his church was open to do it, to get something done for people. So yeah, George was a good person, and yes, he believed in nonviolence, and he tried to practice it, return good for evil. But he made the point that he was ordained to preach what Jesus practiced, not what he practiced. That's his way out of it.
Well, and I know you have a story. One time he was visiting you in Boston, and he knew that Charles Sweeney lived in Boston, and Sweeney was the guy who flew the bomber on August 9th and let the atomic bomb on Nagasaki. And you have a story of going out to lunch with the two of these guys. And I'm just wondering, did George try to go back to those guys that he had, been a priest for, a chaplain for, prayed with, said mass for? Did he ever try to go back to those guys and say, you guys got to get on this nonviolence train. You got to convert. You got to change your mind. I got to bring you over to my side so we can tell people that this was wrong? Because my understanding is that Charlie Sweeney never regretted dropping the bomb. He stood by it till his dying day. So did George ever try to go and change their minds and talk to them about this? I would love to be there and hear what happened at that lunch and what kind of conversations came up.
Well, I know that they never invited George to any of their meetings when they met,
Okay.
That's one thing. But when George came to the house one time, and this was before I was ordained a priest. Was it before I was ordained a priest? Yeah, before I was ordained a priest. So it had to be the 70s, late 70s, And No, it had to be after I was ordained a priest, because I remember we talked about Byzantine stuff there. Okay, so at any rate, he came to the house one time, and I had mentioned that Charlie Sweeney, who was the major in the United States Army Air Corps in 1945, who was the pilot of the boxcar, which was the plane that dropped the atomic bomb on Nagasaki, lived here in Boston. And he had an article in the paper or something about how he'd do it again. It was the only thing to do. And then I mentioned that, no priest, no anyone ever said a word about it. It's just in the paper and let it go by. It's okay, that's all right. Well, George said, let me find him. I'm going to call him and see and talk to him. So I don't know how he got his telephone number or where he lived or anything, because I didn't know, but he did. I guess he lived over in Milton someplace, and he called him and, oh yeah, I heard him on the phone. They're all buddy. Oh yeah, I remember. And so let's get together. And so they decided to get together at the Howard Johnson's on Route 2. And George said, why don't you come along? So that afternoon I came along and we got together for about 3 hours there. And it was an interesting kind of conversation, because after all those conversations, the conversation basically ran around memories. Do you remember this on Northfield? Do you remember that at Tenny Island? Do you remember that at?
And so they knew each other pretty well, like.
Oh yeah, there was just a normal conversation about what they knew. Yeah,
okay.
Because
Yeah.
Charlie Sweeney was Catholic, so he would have had a relationship with them.
Yeah.
Anyone who wasn't Catholic would not necessarily have any relationship.
Yeah.
And Charlie Sweeney at this time was a general. He was up there, and I think he was a retired general. Yes, because he was president of a shoe company that sold all their shoes to the government. Anyway, we were sitting there, and I couldn't help but think, Ellen, this is off the subject. I couldn't help but think, Charlie Sweeney was the mirror image of me. The mirror image of me before gospel nonviolence. I mean, his words, his speech, his attitudes, his understanding of life, his everything.
The way he talked. From Boston. He had 12 kids.
Charlie Sweeney named one of his 12 children after the coach of Notre Dame. I went to Notre Dame. That's the world of that time in Boston, Yeah, he told George at the table there that day, he said that he almost never missed a Notre Dame game because he'd take training flights to South Bend from Boston, military training flights that he had to take, Yeah. And take the plane out and watch the game and come back that day, Or, anyway, he was spitting him a cigar and everything, and a great guy, a wonderful person. That's how I experienced him. Now, I know the bomb and everything, but that's the way I experienced as a human being.
Mm-hmm.
And so they went on and they gabbed about it and so forth and so on. And then George was up front with him, He said, I made this change. I just think Jesus' teachings are teachings of nonviolence, and I just had to make, and they talked, and Charlie Sweeney just answered something. Yeah, I see your point. That's all. It didn't go any place or anything else.
So George wasn't like combative with him.
Oh no. This was
okay.
Now. Interestingly enough, so I guess that I don't know. Interestingly enough, a couple of days later, Charlie's wife called up George for something. He called my house to get George. And I know what for. She never told me or anything, but everything, it's nothing bad or anything. Anyway, it just seemed to me about the, as I thought about it, it's kind of like Hannah Arendt's book, Eichmann in Jerusalem. he's nothing. He's a guy.
Yeah.
He's doing all this great evil, but he's just a guy. He just no great anything.
Yeah.
Except somehow he's got his hands on this power and told to do it, and he does it.
Mm-hmm.
Auschwitz or whatever, rounding up Jews. And Charlie Sweeney, he's a guy from Boston,
Yeah.
He's nurtured in a particular way, and that particular way allows him to fly Air Force planes and drop bombs, and he did it, And
Yeah. And there was a time when I know you told me before, there was a time when you were going to go, and you had been a Marine, you were going to go back into the military, and something happened that, like, you didn't end up doing that. Like, the phone call didn't come there at the right time or something, and another opportunity came in, and there was this fork in the road. Like, if that hadn't happened, could you have been Charlie Sweeney just as?
Oh, I could have been Charlie Sweeney. I just, that's I say this now, and I thought of it then too. But it's a little scary to see who I was, because Charlie now was in his 50s, late 50s maybe at this point, and that I could have been that,
Mm-hmm.
and that oblivious to everything, absolutely not a bad guy, not someone that sitting next to he'd hurt you or anything, nothing like that. A very decent seeming kind of fellow, happy guy, laughing guy, Irish guy, clearly a good drinking guy, that sort of business there. But nothing that was out of the norm for Irish Catholic Boston at that time. And I was it. And I was it. And yes, I see a multiple of places in my life that I did not know they were defining moments, but they were. And they were defining moments, quite frankly, Ellen, that I didn't make. They were created for me.
Mm-hmm.
I was not looking for them.
It's kind of like that nun that wanted to leave the conference, but it was too full. So she stayed, and then it led to everything, like the chain of grace you're talking about.
The whole chain of grace. Yep, that's absolutely right. I can think of all kinds of things, not all kinds, a few, several moments in my life where that fork in the road you're talking about, and I chose one or the other, but I can't say the motivation was high spirituality. It was just something that was in me that said, go this way rather than that.
Yeah. Do you think,
now,
Charlie?
What do I attribute that to? People always ask me, Ellen, after they've been to a weekend retreat or a week's retreat, whatever it is, they always ask me, look, here, I had this conference, I just gave this conference. Where'd you get all this information? What should I read? How did you get it? How did you put it together? There is no book. There is no book. I put it together. Yeah, I read everything there all I could read on it, and so forth. But I attribute those moments to the fork in the road where I made decisions, not on the basis of any high spirituality or anything, just something in me that said, my sense of things, go this way rather than that. Mm-hmm. And yet those moments, they were definitive. If I had gone the other way, I would be a totally different person. Totally different person. And what do I attribute that to? And now I know your audience is going to be really turned off with this because everyone else is in the peaceful. I attribute it to this, that when I made my first communion, second grade, that was a Saturday. Now, on Sunday, of course, you went to Mass, okay? That was fine. But for some reason, after I made my first communion, that day, that night, that afternoon, I don't know what it was, I remember we went over to a little place after first communion called the Smith House. Doesn't exist anymore. Have a little breakfast kind of thing and all that. But sometime later that day, I got to thinking, now I'm 7 years old, and I'm thinking, and these are the words. This is not something I'm making up now as a later overly educated theologian, you know?
Yeah.
I'm saying to myself at 7 years old, if God is in the Eucharist in a way like he is no place else, as I can find in this world, or whoever find in this world, why are people just going to Mass on Sunday? Why are people just receiving communion on Sunday? And I am now not exaggerating. I'm giving you facts. Starting the following Monday on, the very next Monday after my first communion, there were 2 masses in the parish church, which was 9/10 of a mile from my house, 6:30, 7:15. And for the next 14 years, I went to Mass every day.
Wow.
There was a little hiatus there in high school. Went to Notre Dame every day since. Now, there's been breaks with sickness or travel or whatever the case may be.
Yeah.
But that's it. I think the efficacy, the spiritual efficacy, by which I mean moral and everything else, that lies hidden in the Eucharist is infinite and beyond comprehension.
Mm-hmm.
It's a gift offered. It's ripples effect. The day in, day out, hearing the gospel, hearing the Psalms, receiving the Eucharist, adoration, contrition, thanksgiving, supplication in each Eucharist, day in and day out, in the presence of God in a way that you cannot encounter God any place else in this world.
Mm-hmm.
Whether you're sick, whether you're soaking wet with rain, snow, whether you're hot, you go. What you feel is not the issue. It's that you do it. You will to be there.
Mm-hmm.
God can work with that. And that's what I attributed to. And I would tell that to the Pope. It'd be embarrassing, but I'd tell it to the Pope, you know,
Mm-hmm.
especially since he's closed down all the churches. That's
Yeah. Yeah.
no, I mean, that's a fact. That's a fact. I just tell you that there is a mysterious power in the Eucharist. I don't know what you want to call it. All I know is it's that when there's a fork in the road that I didn't even know I was taking.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Do you think when George said do something for peace, like does daily Mass count as doing something for peace?
Oh, sure.
Okay.
Of course.
Okay.
Of course. You know, I just think that it's if I were any kind of leader of a peace movement, I've never led anything, you know. I can hardly lead my own life well, you know. But you know, I'd say yes. I'd say daily Mass is a commitment, and the time, get the priest out there to say it, or ordain more priests, or whatever you're going to do. But it's really a serious thing to do, because it puts. Look, Ellen, existence that we know, you know, and I know, and everyone listening knows, is a reality beyond human comprehension, utterly beyond human comprehension. We know a little speck, you know. How evil fits into that, how suffering fits into that, how my death, the death of loved ones, fits into that. Utterly beyond me,
Mm-hmm.
utterly beyond me. Now, Jesus comes, he does not explain any of that. Jesus does not give an explanation for evil. He tells us how to conquer it.
Mm-hmm.
And he tells us how to conquer it through the power that he, as God in the flesh. What does it mean to say God is made flesh? Let me give you 3 words. God, like from the Eucharist, God is present. Do you know, in semantics, in epistemology, there are no 3 words that are as indefinite in terms of what you can look into as God is in present. Present. So that doesn't mean they're untrue. It just means they're depth.
Mm-hmm.
And therefore, simply, God is, how can God be present? A piece of, stop it. Stop it. If it's God, God's present.
Oh, yeah.
And so my position is that the overcoming of evil and death for me and for all people comes through one mediator, Jesus, Messiah, God incarnate. One mediator.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that being the case, that means that there's only, step back, there is only one power that can conquer evil. Not my brain. I can't do it. You know, not Trump's brain, not Obama's brain. They're conquering evil. There's only one power that can conquer death. No philosopher knows it. That's God. That's God.
Mm-hmm.
So, if Jesus comes and says, and the presentation is that this is God incarnate, the Word made flesh, then he knows how to overcome evil and death for one and all.
Mm-hmm.
And if he rises from the dead and says, I am with you all days, even until the consolation of the world, that means he is here, not just in his words, not just in the communion with him that comes from following his words. He is here as an active presence in your life that is there, period. And if you wish to be attentive to it, if you wish to respond to it, if you wish to encounter it, it's there always.
Mm-hmm.
And with that encounter, with that, things happen to you. That encounter takes place maximally in the Eucharist.
Mm-hmm.
In the Eucharist. And it affects, the name of that encounter and the way it affects you is grace.
Mm-hmm.
Jesus doesn't just give love your enemies or don't kill people and so forth. What he's giving is the way to access the grace to overcome evil and death. Not a law. He is your road into the grace. The power of grace is what? Grace is God, literally. I mean, I'm saying that literally. Grace is God. God's power is God.
Mm-hmm.
Grace is God, and this is the way you overcome evil and death. This is what nonviolence is all about.
Mm-hmm.
It's not a rule, it's not a law, it's what Jesus said, yes.
Yeah.
But it's about releasing the power of God, which is the power of love,
Yeah.
in the human situation to save people yourself.
Do you think that Charlie Sweeney, he died in 2004, do you think he could be in heaven?
Oh, I tell you this, I think that there is probably, I'm trying to put this on a scale of 1 to 10 for you.
What are the percentage odds?
I would say that Charlie Sweeney probably has a little better chance than me.
Really?
Yep.
But you took the right road and he took the wrong road, clearly.
You know, there's something about the primacy of conscience, which is the overriding morality of the Catholic Church. You've got to follow your conscience, you know. To use the famous quote from Cardinal Newman when they asked him to toast the Pope at at a luncheon after the First Vatican Council, he raised his glass to all these Catholics and he said, to the Pope, but to conscience first. Of course, that's the teaching of the church. Well, Charlie Sweeney, for all I know and from all I've seen and heard, and I don't know the man, he's just there, he was doing what he thought was right. When he used to write those articles on August 9th in the Globe, he was absolutely convinced, that he was stopping the war. He was saving hundreds of thousands of American lives. He was this, that, and the other thing. He didn't think he wasn't doing what the church wanted him to do. Mm-hmm. Not that anyone else in the church,
Yeah.
And so he was perhaps now, he was following a non-culpable but wrong conscience with his whole heart, whole soul, whole mind, whole strength. Why I am following, say, a correct conscience half-heartedly. I don't. How is anyone going to judge if Charlie Sweeney is in heaven or not? It's impossible. But what we will, no. We can't judge that sort of stuff. Of course we can't. But what we do know is Jesus came to save all people. All. And how that's done through the grace of God, released through the incarnation, person, message, death, and resurrection of Jesus, is an utter and complete mystery, and we should stop explaining it. We just should start living the way he said to access the grace that comes from that.
Yeah.
Hey? And then leave God to judge,
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know, as I say, I've got my own problems still on earth, but I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah.
By the way, Ellen, everyone has, because everyone always is in the spot of not knowing how much God gave them to do and that they could have done, that they just diddle away.
Yeah. I think that's the main evil of our technology and the internet and everything. It's like it does just suck away hours and hours and hours into nothing. Even these video games that people are playing, I mean, it's just nothing. It goes to nothing. It goes to nowhere. It's just a big distraction.
To say nothing of fashion.
Yeah. Well, now that's different because
lipstick. Take, for example, lipstick. There's
you have to say, beauty is something of God, right?
That's right. It's God. Does God wear lipstick?
Yeah.
Jesus had a beard, Ellen, but he didn't have lipstick. Now.
True. Well, yeah, that's true. You got me there. Yeah.
There you go.
I've often thought too, and I'm going to wrap it up in a second, but these two figures, George Zabelka was there at the, Tinian Island, the Catholic chaplain for the greatest acts of destruction. And another big 20th century movement or figure, I guess, is the Divine Mercy. And Michael Sapochko, I think that's how you say his name, who was the confessor of St. Faustina. And after her death, continued to promote the devotion. He was a chaplain in World War I. And I've never seen anything really written about that. But without him, we would not have Divine Mercy Sunday. We would not have the Divine Mercy image, the whole devotion, the chaplet. And so it's like God placed these two people at the height of this violence in our 20th century, and they both ended up kind of ushering in, becoming spokespeople for mercy, nonviolence. It just seems to me important. I don't know. But again, it's one of those things you never see anybody write about it, talk about it. I've been looking for years for more information about his time in the war, and I've seen some things that he's written that have said, I didn't see it before, I didn't know it, but now I do. So kind of the same But there was no, I guess there was no Sojourner's article. There was no Charlie McCarthy to interview him about that. It doesn't seem to be out there. I wish it was. I don't know.
Well, I think that nonviolence is just a word. The word doesn't exist in the New Testament.
Yeah.
It doesn't. It's a modern word, just like pacifism, you know. But the reality that it's talking about does exist in the New Testament. Returning good for evil, loving your enemies, et cetera, right?
Yeah.
Not killing people, turning your cheek, walking the extra mile, that all exists, and that's all encompassed. Love is Christ's love. That's in the New Testament, you know, and the model is Him. So that how we, everything that I say, I always joke about this. I said, you know, when I read, and I've read extensively, the writings of Saint Teresa of Lisieux, the little flower, and the writings about her. But her writings, her family's writings about her sisters, her mother's writings are extraordinary. See where Teresa came from. It was the mother that nurtured, incredible woman, because she was all, people then wrote letters, you know, and other people kept them. So she wrote letters to people, and extraordinary letters. But my sense of the thing is, in St. Teresa, I used to say that it's an anachronism, you know? But I think St. Teresa was at one of my workshops and stole my stuff and put it in her story of a soul.
Yeah.
That's what happened.
Yeah.
It's all there. It's all there.
Yeah.
Her little way is the little deed of Christ-like love.
Mm-hmm.
Christ-like love measured by the gospel. You know, she even says that the whole world opened up to her when she finally saw the meaning. This is in the story of a soul, her famous book that's probably the most read book in Catholicism in the 20th century, where she says explicitly, the whole world of love opened up to her, and what it meant when she became aware, conscious of the meaning of the new commandment. Love one another as I have loved you.
Mm-hmm.
She says, before Jesus, that is before the grace that comes with life, death, resurrection, etc. Before Jesus, God could only expect us to love our neighbor as ourselves. But now, baptized after Jesus, with His grace, now God calls us to love as He loved.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I mean, she took that right out of my workshop.
Clearly.
She did.
Stealing
Yeah,
ideas.
right.
Yeah.
Plagiarism.
Yeah.
No, everything is there in the gospel, you know?
Mm-hmm.
It's all there. You don't need me. You know? But what isn't there, of course, what is the problem, is that the church and secular culture, but the church primarily, censors it, does not let it be heard, waters it down, dismisses it, says it's unrealistic, and gives all kinds of options why you don't have to follow. And so that being the case, and then nurtures these from the cradle by families, and that being the case, it becomes very, very, very difficult to see. We're blinded.
And I don't think that EWTN probably wasn't consciously censoring it, but they didn't see what you were saying as being Catholic.
Yeah,
it didn't resonate with what they knew their faith to be, but that's
no. They didn't. I think there's a. I would say that. I would say that. I say that's true up to a point. But these are smart people with smart businessmen behind them, smart Catholics behind them, and priests. And they know that is the people running this operation, not poor Mother Angelica. the people that's really behind this with the big dough and the big money and so forth and so on, the legatus kind of people, the Opus Dei kind of people, money. They know that Jesus' teachings of nonviolent love of friends and enemies is right at the heart of the gospel. It's there in the Gospels. They know that. A friend of mine, a scripture scholar, he might be dead now because he was quite a bit older than me, who taught at Boston College. That's where you got your summa cum laude from, isn't it?
Oh, I'm glad you brought that up. Yeah.
Just was going to try to give you a little pat in the back, you know? Bob was a New Testament scholar and spent his whole life in this field. And he taught there, and he taught a lot of other places too. One day, Brother Paul Feeney and I were up to see him about the possibility of about having a conference at Boston College, a conference with all the Catholic people from the various disciplines, the scholars, from liturgy, from scripture, from dogma, from you name it, pastoral, who were absolutely committed to gospel nonviolence, and have the conference at BC over several days. And by having this, and having them say this, and having them make it clear that nonviolence is consistent with Jesus' teaching and all these things, and what more could be done to make it visible within these various sections of the church, it would free up the bishops and the priests maybe to say something about it. Because the scholars are saying, they're saying in the Catholic context. Mm-hmm. And anyway, that never came off. Bob said that he tried to, but they wouldn't accept it as something they'd fund. Anyway, when we were talking to him that day, Bob, who he was involved with the bishops, helping them understand scripture and do things and write things, you know. Bob said that as far as he was concerned, as far as he is concerned, the Catholic bishops of the United States have known since the mid-70s that Jesus was nonviolent and that he taught a way of nonviolence. That's not even a question that they know it. They know it. He said his opinion, just observing, was they don't know what to do with it. Mm. They're terrified. If they ever say it out loud, they'll divide the church. People will leave. Money will leave.
Well, people are leaving anyway. Church schools are closing down. They don't have any money anyway. Why not just do it at this point? You know what I mean?
We never got to that point, but that was his analysis of what was at stake. That it was a fearsome option to have to say it.
That's why they talk about it, but they don't. It's like they all want to talk about peace, but they don't address it head on. They just don't directly talk about it.
They don't want to talk about it in terms of how Jesus talked about it.
Yeah.
And that's the only way the church is in existence for, to talk about things as Jesus talked about them. Now, saying that he thought, he was pretty sure the Catholic bishops thoroughly understood that this was teaching of Jesus in Scripture, New Testament Gospels, since the mid-1970s, but they were afraid that if they ever raised this publicly, that there would be such a division in the church that bad things would happen. The problem here is, are you creating unity by untruth? Mm-hmm. Are you creating unity around error? Are you creating unity by lying? Lying by silence, or lying by minimizing? But are you creating unity around evil? That's what I'm saying. Mm-hmm. Once you say you understand this, Charlie Sweeney, I don't think he understood it at all. I think he was a just war, Catholic, and he lived what he taught.
Mm-hmm.
But if you know Jesus' teachings are teachings of nonviolent love of friends and enemies, and you know the history of how this was dealt with over the 1700 years since Constantine, that is, that it was pushed down,
Mm-hmm.
and you know that, and you do not say it, and your job is to care for souls, are you really caring for souls by not telling them what Jesus taught? That's impossible.
Yeah, and I've often wondered if it didn't do more harm than good to put, there's like a blurb in the Catechism after Vatican II that says that, the dropping of a nuclear weapon and the obliteration of entire cities is always off the table. So in terms of the just war theory, we all know that to kill civilians intentionally is wrong. You can't do it. But they explicitly said you cannot use weapons of mass destruction. And I've often wondered if that's just doing more harm than good, because it's like, oh, okay, we can wage war, but there are certain kinds of weapons that the Catholic Church is telling us not to use. But they're just going to come up with something even worse. I mean, with the technology and where everything's going, and that puts the church in the position of having to come out and make a statement on every kind of weapon that humans are going to use to do their violence against one another. And I think it sends the message by saying you can't use this weapon. It kind of sends a message that like everything else is okay though. Do you know what I mean?
Oh, in the 12th century, the church formally condemned as intrinsically evil the use of the crossbow. That's the bow with the trigger. Intrinsically evil, can never be used. It was so deadly. Well,
Yeah.
where are we?
Right.
Jesus, Jesus does not teach rejection of nuclear weapons only, or nuclear killing only. He teaches the rejection of all weaponry, all killing, all violence.
Mm-hmm.
It's like the right to life movement. Jesus does not teach complete pacifism in terms of the child in utero. And then once the child is born, well, the game's over.
Yeah. Yeah.
No, Jesus teaches the rejection of violence in utero, post utero.
Mm-hmm.
Nuclear weapons, all weapons. But see, if what you're teaching is that Jesus says this is true, and it is, whatever it might be, and then you go on to say, but this is also true, what you're doing is you're teaching half-truths.
Mm-hmm.
And half-truths are whole lies. Half-truths are whole lies. And when you're dealing with a whole lie, you are not dealing with the spirit and the truth of Christ.
Mm-hmm.
Because Christ does not lie, and the Holy Spirit is the spirit of truth.
Mm-hmm.
And therefore, you are doing what you're doing. That may be whether you're against nuclear war or you're against abortion, but it's not the spirit of Christ that's leading you to that. It's a philosophy that says this killing is unacceptable, but this killing
Mm-hmm.
is wrong.
Mm-hmm.
This is acceptable.
Yeah.
No. So if you're outside the spirit of Christ, if you're outside the teachings of Christ, you don't have an ice cube's chance in hell of overcoming evil and death.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
As the saying goes.
Well, Charlie, this has been a great conversation. Thanks for telling us more about George Zabelka. And I know we've been going for 2 hours now, but the main problem is that my lipstick has worn off. And so I think it's a good time to call it,
I mean, I understand, not only that, your mascara is dripping.
Is it?
Your eyelashes are falling out.
Oh, no, my goodness.
Your eyeliner's gone. Your eyebrow pencil is dripping. Come on, Ellen. Come on. Gee whiz.
It's just that time. Yeah.
Let me finish with a story about George.
Okay.
At George's 50th anniversary,
Of
Mass.
what?
His
50th?
50th anniversary of his ordination.
Okay, and I have a picture of that, right?
That's
You
the
and
picture with George and I coming back down the aisle. Yeah.
yeah.
George is, yeah, okay. So at his 50th anniversary of his ordination Mass, he gave a homily. And what he said in his homily, I think I got it here somewhere, I don't know, someplace I got it. What he said in his homily, he said, well, he said, you know, you all know I was a military chaplain and so forth and blah, 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 all that. Yeah. And he said, I'm really a lot of friends from those days and everything else, you know. And then he said, but then I was on the altar, huh? And he said, well, then Charlie came along and he said, he started telling this stuff about nonviolence and loving your enemies and so forth and so on. He said, I listened to him, but he said, I was really dubious. Really, he said, I wasn't buying it. But he went on and on and on. He wouldn't stop, you know. So I had to listen. I was there. So, but he said, I'll tell you this, he said. When I got back to my parish, when I got back to my rectory, he said, I thought about it, kind of kept thinking about it. And he said, you know what I did? He said, there I was. He said, I went to the Catholic Bible. And I looked in the Catholic Bible and geez, there it says, love your enemies. Jesus is saying it. Then I go to the Protestant Bible. Geez, same thing. We hardly agree on anything, but this we agree. He said this. Then I went to the Orthodox Bible, and there it is. It says, love your enemies. And he said, it just stuck with me that how can I love my enemies if I'm killing them? It didn't make sense. And all the Catholic, Protestant, by the three Bibles, they all said the same thing, love your enemies. They commanded it. And he said, I just, at that point there, he said, I really had problems. And I had to really go into this and see what it was all about, you know?
Yeah.
And he did. And that, by the way, that's courage too. He didn't stop with just a little queasiness about something.
Mm-hmm.
He went forward, even though it was going to upset his whole self-understanding and God understanding.
Yeah.
Courage. Again,
And probably the thing that he had been like proudest of in his life, you know,
yeah.
That's the thing that he had to reconsider or see in a different light. And yeah, that takes a lot of, courage to do that. So
absolutely. Yeah. Anyway, Ellen, that's George. And let me, because you're doing this thing on George, I'll tell you this. In 1995, on the 50th anniversary of the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, 75th this year, right? On the 50th anniversary, I and another priest went to Hiroshima and Nagasaki for the days. And so we were going to celebrate with cardinals and bishops and everyone else as the Hiroshima Cathedral, 6 o'clock Mass on August 6th. And I thought it was going to be just a little, 40. There were hundreds of priests there. I'd say great percentage of them Japanese, but also from other countries, you know? Mm-hmm. And so we were all standing in this line outside with stoles and no chasubles or anything, just stoles and alms. And so I'm standing there with this other priest from America, and I look down, two rows in front of me, or priest, huh? 2 rows in front of me. I look and I see this priest, looks like Japanese priest, and I see him, he's got his stole on, and on his stole, he has this button, round white button that says in English, do something for peace. Now, George, this was his theme, do something for peace, do. And so he gave these buttons out by the tens of thousands. So anyway, I worked my way down to the line to him, we were just standing. And I said, hi, I'm, I said, where'd you get that button? And he said, oh, he said, back in about the middle 80s, he said, the priest who gave me this, his name is Father George Zabelka, and he was the Catholic chaplain for the bomb crews that dropped the atomic bombs on Japan, Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And he said back in the middle 80s, 85 or something like that, he said he came here and he did a pilgrimage from Hiroshima and Nagasaki, a walk, and in both places, he said mass and he apologized to the Japanese people, the Japanese Christians, saying that he was gravely sorry that this was evil that he participated in, and that he was supposed to bring the mercy as a priest, and he brought the misery. And he said it was genuine. It was genuine. He had tears in his eyes and so forth. He went to see the hibakusha, the people who were damaged by the bomb. He said, and you know, he said, I when I heard him, I walked with him, and he gave me one of these buttons. I said, oh, he said, do you know George? I heard of him, yeah. Anyway, he went on to say, now this is the part I'm getting to. He went on to say, you know, this priest, George Zabelka, he said, Father George Zabelka, always Father there. This priest, Father George Zabelka, he said, you know, in some sections of Japanese Christianity, he's considered a saint. And I said, that's what he said. And the other priest was there right with me, listening. Gary, he's considered a saint. And I said, why? He said, because he's the only priest, the only clergyman that ever came back here from America and said he was sorry, that he did something wrong, he made a grievous mistake, and to ask forgiveness.
Wow.
I think that's a good story to conclude on.
It's a great story to conclude on. Yes. That's awesome. All right. Well, everybody go do something for peace today in honor of George. And thank you for joining us. Thanks for your time, Charlie. It's always appreciated so much.
You're welcome, Ellen.